Joining me now to discuss those latest anti-Semitic attacks in Melbourne is Alex Ryvchin, the co-CEO and Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Alex, thanks so much for joining Sky News.
Thank you.
What have you made of these latest incidents?
Look, it's an atrocity. It's a horrific thing to have members of the Jewish community in a place of worship where they're safe, where they gather to mark special days like the Jewish Sabbath, and to have someone trying to burn the place down with 20 Jewish people inside on a Friday evening. It's horrific. And then across town, 20 minutes later, you have this violent mob with their death chants storming a restaurant where people were simply dining and enjoying Melbourne on a Friday night and having to cower in a restaurant and fear for their lives and their safety. It makes me furious, and there's a simmering rage in the Jewish community at the moment that this has been allowed to happen, that we've gotten to this point where this movement, which has projected its aims all the way through about globalizing the Intifada, about bringing violence to our streets, and that this has been allowed to happen. We're furious, and we need all Australians to stand with us in purging this from our sight. This can't become the norm in our cities and in our CBDs.
What have you made of the response to these latest incidents from state and federal leaders?
Well, at a rhetoric level, the response has been as one would expect. It's been strong and unequivocal and timely, which is fine, but we're well beyond the point of words. We need to see action, and that's what the Jewish community is calling for. I think for too long, there's been this willingness to give the benefit of the doubt to these people when there is no doubt. They've spoken about what their intentions are, what their aims are, what their beliefs are. It's apparent that they belong to a violent, extreme ideology. Now they chant about death. They don't talk about ceasefire. They don't talk about peace. They don't talk about two-state solutions. And we have to take them at their word. We have to take this as a serious threat to our public order and to our national security.
After a significant, summer of anti-Semitic attacks, certainly in Sydney and in Melbourne, we were all out there on the ground covering it. It was relentless. It feels as though we haven't seen as many of those really large-scale incidents as we did during that period. Why do you think there's this surge now?
Well, we had a summer of horrific incidents, as you mentioned there, and that seemed to have passed us by. But a lot of people treated that as the end of the anti-Semitic crisis in this country. But the Jewish community knew better. We were experiencing things in schoolyards and university campuses on the streets. We were carefully monitoring the social media discourse. We were looking at what was happening abroad. And the movement against Israel and against the Jewish community did not go away. And it continued to advocate, it continued to organize, it continued to identify targets. We saw a murderous attack by someone chanting Free Palestine in Washington, D.C. outside a Jewish museum. We saw the attack on elderly people marching peacefully in Boulder, Colorado, with a woman in her 80s burned to death, again by a person chanting Free Palestine. We've seen extremist scenes in our cultural festivals like at Glastonbury. So the Jewish community has been saying all the way through that this anti-Semitic crisis is not over. The ideology remains with us, and it remains intent on destroying our society. It's not merely the Jewish community that's a threat here. I think all Melbourne residents will think long and hard about entering their CBD when they see mobs like this running rampant. And I think we as a country have a choice to make as to who holds sway, whether we can allow these sorts of mobs to do what they do with impunity and utter disregard for the welfare of their fellow Australians, or whether we take a stand against it.
We've seen opposition leader Susan Lee, Liberal MP Julian Leeser come out and write a letter to the government and say there needs to be greater security measures to try to prevent some of these incidents from occurring. What extra measures do you think are needed that aren't already in place?
Well, security is one thing that is obviously spoken about after these sorts of attacks. And we saw after the burning of the Adas synagogue, greater security funding to secure Jewish venues and likely targets of these sorts of attacks. That's all good and well, but the Jewish community, we said so at the time, obviously we need to be secure. And when you have direct threats leveled at Jewish institutions on a near daily basis, security is an imperative. But at the same time, we need to move beyond the reaction of security, and we need to look at the cause of this. And prior to the election, my organization handed down a comprehensive 15-point plan of action to actually address anti-Semitism, to move beyond the reactions of more watchtowers and more cameras, which is not how the Jewish community wants to live, but to actually address what's happening and to deal with it in a comprehensive fashion. So Of course, there'll be talk about the need for security, but I think we need to move towards actually talking about education and engagement and migration laws and the cultural festivals where a lot of this ideology is allowed to fester. We need a much more comprehensive response and not merely more security.
And that plan put forward at the Sky News Anti-Semitism Summit as well. Still, it seems a lot more work to be done. Thank you so much for your time, Alex Ryvchin.
Thank you. Thank you.